This morning, if you haven't gathered, we are talking about Nehemiah. Last week, Eric led us through a sermon and understanding the book of Ezra, and this is a continuation of that. Nehemiah, for some of the note takers, I'll go through all the facts and stuff first, and we'll jump into the meaty part. But Nehemiah was authored by Ezra. Again, Ezra wrote both books, and they originally would have been one book and then were split in two. And we can date Nehemiah likely after 433 BCE. Nehemiah was written likely for the returning exiles, people of Jerusalem who had been exiled to Babylon and were now returning to their home. This book was written to record the temple rebuilding process and the city rebuilding process of Jerusalem and to model quality leadership and what leaders should look like. Our theme this morning is restoration of the city of God. And we can break Nehemiah down into three sections: Nehemiah's return, chapters 1 and 2, rebuilding the city, chapters 3 through 7, and revival from Ezra, chapters 8 through 13. Now, I know Eric gave me a very glowing introduction last week, and when I talk to pastors that I know about this book, they all say that typically pastors talk about visionary leadership when talking about Nehemiah. And part of me wanted to stray from that and find my own thing, and then part of me realized that I should just take the easy path when it's handed to me. So I'm going to do that. So this morning, we're going to talk about visionary leadership and what that looks like both in Nehemiah and in a couple examples from our society as we know today. So what is visionary leadership? It's definitely a phrase that is thrown around in the corporate world when someone's trying to rally the troops and trying to create a common goal for employees or people to kind of rally together to complete something. And so I looked it up because the dictionary never lies. And vision is defined as the ability to imagine how a country, society, industry, etc. could develop in the future and to plan for this. So that's vision. Visionary leadership is the ability to have that vision and then make it into a reality. So when we talk about visionary leadership, a lot of people will say that Nehemiah was a visionary leader. So the first question I asked myself when processing this book is, how did Nehemiah exhibit leadership? And throughout my college career and also in my beginning of career life, we talk about leadership a lot, especially with people my age. What does being a leader look like? What are quality leadership examples? And I talk about this with the youth group a lot to see how they can recognize quality leaders in their life. And oftentimes we talk about honesty, integrity, reliability, passion. But something that Nehemiah exhibits in his leadership is the use and the utility of prayer. Nehemiah prays about his next steps, how to follow his call, and what he can do to create the world that God envisions for us. Nehemiah would always pray and then sandwich his prayers with thanksgiving and praise at the beginning and the end, and we've kind of adopted that model of prayer into worship as we move through our lives today. On the other side of Nehemiah's visionary leadership, we learn that he was a good leader, and I'll jump into some of those qualities in a little bit. But what was Nehemiah's vision? In the book of Nehemiah, we learn that Jerusalem has been completely demolished. It's rubble, it's gone. It is a very sad example of what happens when a nation like Jerusalem falls prey to a nation like Babylon. Nehemiah gets to see Jerusalem, and it breaks his heart. It shatters him. And this heartbreak is so powerful that he decides to do something about it. So Nehemiah, in the course of his time in exile, had worked his way up to becoming a right-hand man to the king, a king's attendant. And in this time, he developed a relationship with the king and gained trust and respect. And he found himself in a position where he could go to the king and say, hey, my home has been destroyed. It is a place that I am proud of. It is a place that I love. It is a huge part of my identity and the identity of the people that you are holding here in exile. Will you give me the people and the resource that I need to go back and rebuild it. And the king grants him this ability and grants him gives him the permission to go home and rebuild. This vision of what Nehemiah knew Jerusalem to be, and the vision that he knew Jerusalem could return to, why is this important? Why is the wall important? What about Jerusalem was so great that it needed to be rebuilt? Well, the city wall that we see in this whole book is centered around the rebuilding of represents Jerusalem's independence and its ability to self-sustain and protect the people within the city walls. The wall is an outward expression of their strength and directly ties to the inward pride and morale that people felt for their home. So when the wall itself was destroyed, it was not only a signal to surrounding nations that Jerusalem was weak and that one of their biggest enemies was now gone and had been dealt with, it also showed the rest of the world that the people of Jerusalem were compromised and were weak and could easily be overtaken as well. We, in our lives today, we all have walls. We all have outward expressions of our pride and what we adhere our identities to on the inside. We also have walls that are broken. We have walls that are standing and strong, and people look at me and they can pretty much tell that I really love Jesus a lot, and that is a really solid wall in my life. But they can also, once you get to know me, you can see that things like anxiety and depression, those are broken walls in my life that show that that's a part of my life that I'm continually rebuilding. We all have walls that tell people that we are broken, that we are no longer strong and independent. We all have these individually, but we also have them corporately. And something that I find fitting that today is Independence Day, the United States has a few walls that can tell nations around the world that we're great, but we could be better, and there's always work to be done. Our wall could look like racial inequality and inequity. It can look like prejudice against people in the LGBTQIA+ community. It can look like socioeconomic disparity. It can look like all of the isms that we still struggle with on a daily basis here in this country. These walls of ours may not be completely broken. We've had leaders in the past start the rebuilding process and put in the work that have created foundations for us to leap off of. But we individually and corporately still have work to be put into them. These walls also aren't only external. We have all formed personal ideologies that we may need to reevaluate and start rebuilding and recreating alongside the greater corporate walls that we project to the world. If the walls that we build internally don't match the walls that we're projecting externally, they're both destined to break. So when we talk about visionary leadership, it's easy to look at the Bible and see the greats and see kind of like, oh, that was their problem. It's external, doesn't really show up in my life today, so it doesn't really matter. But when I think of visionary leaderships in our leaders in our lives and in our history, my brain first goes to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Like Nehemiah, Dr. King and Nehemiah, and I mean, if you want to, this is like the easy Sunday school answer, but Jesus was also a visionary leader. All three of these men were both disliked and threatened. Nehemiah frequently received threats from surrounding nations saying, who do you think you are? By what authority have you come back here to start rebuilding? This is a huge undertaking. You're not going to do it. You're not going to succeed. Dr. King received death threats very, very, very frequently, him and his family both. And it was a similar theme of who do you think you are? You're just one man. On top of that, you're just one colored man. Who do you think you are to rebuild the foundations of this nation? Dr. King and Nehemiah, their visions both stem from a place of profound heartbreak and profound pain for their home and for the pride and that they felt for the places that they call home and the communities that they call family. Nehemiah saw his home literally destroyed, whereas Dr. King, through his childhood and his early adulthood and adolescence, he saw small fractures in the way that he was treated, in the opportunities that he was given or that were withheld from him, and in the ways that he was discriminated against. Both of these breakings of home and identity led to both men needing to know and figuring out that something needed to be done. Both experienced an evolution in their leadership styles. Nehemiah climbed the ranks to get close to the king and create a relationship that would allow trust to form and opportunities to be given, whereas Dr. King began as a Baptist minister. So, ta-da! After leading a congregation, Dr. King was then voted to chair some committees in his hometown because they knew that if you were a minister, you were probably well-spoken and he could advocate for the people that needed to be advocated for. After that, Dr. King moved to state advocation and a state presence to speak against segregation and racial inequality. And then quickly that gained traction and Dr. King became nationally known. And each evolution in his leadership style grew with more and more and more disdain from people who did not agree. So we know that Nehemiah's vision centered around rebuilding his home and creating a space for his people to go back to and a place for them to feel pride in who they were and who they are. But what was Dr. King's vision? I'm sure all of you know this answer, but when we speak about vision, the easiest example and one of the most profound examples is the I Have a Dream speech. I'm going to read a few points from this speech, probably one of the most well-known sections, so that we might be able to sit ourselves in a position to really feel the power that was behind this vision to help us understand the profound hurt and the profound change that needed to happen. Dr. King says, I have a dream that one day, on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This speech, this vision, was broadcasted everywhere, and it was well known by all people, but it was not well accepted by all people. It's still not well accepted by people today. Today, the inequality and the prejudices that we encounter aren't as obvious, but they are just as real as ever. Dr. King worked hard to make his dream a reality, and like Eric talked about last week, some of us could say it wasn't a success. It's easy for us to look at the world we live in today and to look at the world Dr. King lived in not that long ago and to say, we haven't really come that far. Since I am not far removed from the public school system, it is easy for me to look at what I was taught and to not really realize how recent that was. I remember in high school in the AP US History class learning about the Civil Rights Movement and the work that was put into this country. All of the photos in our textbooks were black and white. All of them. This was to give the illusion that it was something that happened much, much farther in the past than it did. My parents were alive when Dr. King was assassinated. So how did Dr. King make his vision a reality? An example of this that stands out to me is a quote from Margaret Mead. She says, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." While Dr. King's message was known nationally and globally, it didn't gain traction on that level. Dr. King knew that his work and his vision needed to start in a community, in a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens who were devoted to making change happen. Nehemiah knew the same thing. Nehemiah knew that broadcasting his vision of wanting to rebuild his home and recreate one of the most powerful entities in the world at that time would not gain traction nationally. And so he reached out to a community on an interpersonal level to enact change in his community first. We can do the same thing. When we talk about visionary leadership, it's easy to look at the greats, to Nehemiah, to Dr. King, Nelson Mandela, Mother Teresa, Jesus. It's easy to put it on a pedestal and say, I feel the same way, but someone else will do it. I feel really passionately about this, but someone else will do it. Someone younger, someone more excited about it, someone who knows more people that can get stuff done. But the ways that we change the world begin interpersonally. It begins in communication and relationship and in sharing the dreams and the vision that we have, not only for our lives, but for our children's lives, our grandchildren's lives, of the world that we want to see the people who follow us live into. So what vision do you cast in your life? What legacy do you want to leave, or what legacy do you want to create that makes this world look a little bit more like God's vision for this world? There are a few things that we need to know when we begin the process of making our vision a reality, and Eric kind of touched on this last week. We need to know that there's no guarantee of success. And that's true with anything. My notes, I think I'm funny. I said it's not a great ROI. The return on investment is not high. And this is true because both Nehemiah and Dr. King followed a call. They had a comfortable space that they were in. They had the proverbial job security. They knew that Nehemiah was always going to have a king to serve, and Dr. King knew he was always going to have a congregation to preach to. But they took the step by following their call out into the world to serve their people. Nehemiah knew he wasn't called to serve kings, he was called to serve his people. Dr. King knew he was called to serve his people, and that transformed into called to serve all people. Following a call doesn't ever guarantee success, and it's definitely not guaranteed to be easy. But as our scripture mentioned today, the surrounding nations, the enemies, when they heard about it, they were afraid and their confidence was shaken. And this was happening because they knew that this work was completed with the help of our God. I don't know about you all, but when I do something knowing that God's on my side, it's usually not the popular opinion. When I'm following God and not following society, it's usually not the popular opinion. We all have the ability to create visionary change, visionary leadership in our lives because of the relationship and the privilege that we have to get to know God. The people in our lives, oftentimes, they'll share a vision with you. It just takes courage to name that and to express that, and even more courage to follow it and turn it into a reality. Nehemiah, the wall was completed, but at the end of the book, we still kind of are left feeling like, what now? That wasn't really enough. I don't really feel fulfilled. The same thing can be seen with Dr. King's work today. Dr. King didn't really become the face of the civil rights movement until after he died, after he was killed. We all have internal walls, like I've said, that need to be reevaluated, rebuilt. Maybe even you need to demolish them first and then start rebuilding from there. It's easy to look at me and be like, who are you to talk about racial inequality? And I definitely didn't write this down. I didn't say this earlier, but I'm going to say it now. I was born in Transylvania, Romania. My parents are gypsy, which, when I tell people that, especially people my age, they don't know that gypsy's a race. They're like, what does that mean? Can you tell me your fortune? Not a fortune teller. But for most of my life, growing up in a very white, very middle-class environment, I got the casual racism. I got the, what are you? And I'd say human, female, a Christian. And they'd be like, no, really, what are you? Or I would get the, well, who are your real parents? Or I'd get, in college, the, can I guess your ethnicity? No one ever guessed right. Or I'd get sometimes the backhanded, "You have such beautiful dark features. Where are you from?" And if I said the Quad Cities, they'd be like, "No, where are you from?" And it's over the past few years, very recently actually, I've begun the internal process of internalizing the fact that I am not white. I am gypsy. I am Middle Eastern. I have Egyptian. I have Italian, Greek. I have Bangladeshi in me. I've done the 23andMe. I've done the Ancestry, and it's been a lot of work to internalize not only my identity, but how I express that to the world, and similarly, how I respect others' identities and how I see others' identities in my life. One of my best friends immigrated from India, and we make jokes about it all the time, but there are times where I'll introduce her as, "This is Ela, she's my angry brown friend." And that's her words. She started it, I promise. But there are, especially in my community of people my age, it's easy for us to kind of crack jokes and to kind of brush things under the rug. And my message this morning, if you hear anything, I want you to hear that we all have internal work to do to be more respectful of others' identities in our lives and our own identities. And the walls in which that we enrich and that we bolster and that we make sure are strong and sturdy, those will make the outward expression of our identity all the more clear and all the more accepting to those around us. So how can we cast vision? How can we build and rebuild walls in our lives? It begins in community, it begins in relationship, and it begins in the conversations that you're having. The visions that you have for your life and for this world, they are valid and they are good and they're powerful. And I promise that by sharing them, you will change the world. Will you pray with me? Loving and gracious God, I thank you so much for our ability to worship together this morning. I thank you for the ways in which that you have blessed this community and blessed this church and blessed me to be able to stand here and express your message to the people in this space. I pray that as we move throughout our lives, we can continue to look to leaders like Nehemiah and Dr. King for how we need to be in relationship with those around us. I pray that the walls that we build interpersonally and corporately, I pray that they are expressions of who we are and that they are positive ones in that light. I pray that the people in our lives come to understand who you are and the power that you hold and the goodness and greatness that comes with being in relationship with you. I thank you so much for the words that you've given me this morning and for the ways in which these people hear your love and your message today. It's in your name that I pray. Amen.